goes down to Pasadena because he is still a writer. He's trying to get back into the writing game, but he's slow. He's kind of dejected. Obviously, for somebody like him, I mean, if you kind of put yourself in his shoes for a second, which is kind of hard to do, but if you can do it, he was all about himself and how awesome he was. And he just had this war experience that was the exact opposite of all of his expectations of what he thought he was going to pull off. He thought he was going to go into military intelligence. He thought he was going to be, king cock of the walk and all that. No, none of that happened. So he was pretty dejected, pretty demoralized after the war. He gets back into writing circles. He's having trouble writing. He's having trouble focusing. And he meets up with some other writers and ends up at a house in Pasadena owned by a legit rocket scientist named Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was one of the founding members of Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And this was...
APL.
That's right. Early stage rocket science, mid-stage rocket science. And truly, Jack Parsons was really knew what he was doing with that. But the other thing that Jack Parsons was involved in was the occult. And that was the other side of him. And they've even made a TV series about him now. I forgot what it's called, but they're dramatizing the hell out of that. But now, Jack Parsons was
occult. Do you mean like astrology? Do you mean tarot cards? Like, what do you mean?
I mean the Ordo Templi Orientis and Aleister Crowley. That aspect of the occult.
That's like the classic Church of Satan stuff before the Church of Satan became secular, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, that was part of it. There were rituals. There's blood magic. It's magic with a K. So Aleister Crowley, of course, was his own kind of nonsensical figure and infamously famous as the Beast and all that. Hubbard and Crowley never actually met. Crowley was over in England at this time. Parsons was Crowley's acolyte and student, right? Meaning student. And he was really into this black magic stuff. The other thing that Jack Parsons was into was sharing his house with all kinds of odd people, right? Pseudoscience believers, gypsies, fortune tellers. He loved all that kind of stuff. He just loved it. And he had this really big...
My listeners like to remind people that gypsy isn't a term we use today sometimes because people find it disparaging. Sure. But that's not to correct you. It's just, I don't want my listeners to get mad at me, so...
Fair enough.
Keep going.
Yeah, I just meant nomadic people who are not really tied down by anything and have some pretty interesting beliefs.
We know what you mean when you say it, but then we're not supposed to say it. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so this house that L. Ron Hubbard arrived to meet Jack Parsons and find a place to stay for a little while because he was kind of out of a home because he wasn't willing to go back to Washington and get back to a normal life. That wasn't Hubbard's thing. He wasn't into going back to that family. He wasn't a family man that way. So he arrives here and Jack Parsons takes him in. He finds him to be a flamboyant, interesting character. And of course, at this point now, trying to ingratiate himself with Parsons, get this free, have a cheap place to stay. He starts telling all these tall tales about his history, his war record, etc. And Jack Parsons had a girlfriend named Sarah. And Jack was also unconventional for the 1940s, into open relationships. So he was kind of like, free love, all that. He was kind of down with that. So Hubbard comes in and says, oh, yeah? Well, this girl you're hooked up with is kind of cute. I think I want her. And he starts moving in on her and gets her to kind of couple with him, with Hubbard. So he basically steals Jack's girl, and so to speak, because Jack was a little jealous. We know a lot of this because Jack kept journals. Hubbard talks about this period a little bit. The church has whitewashed all of this, but Hubbard actually got involved in occult practices at this house with Jack Parsons, and they engaged in sex magic rituals. involving blood and masturbation and sexual practices. And again, I don't want to go into all the gory details because it's kind of complicated and very weird. But that much of it gives you the flavor of what life was like at this house.
And just to draw a couple more parallels, we know that when Joseph Smith was a young boy, he heard about Sally Chase, a glass licker. He learned about Luman Walters, a charlatan that would come into the community. And what we have here also as a parallel is kind of like the young, aspiring, eventual religious founder finding mentors in various different sort of approaches to being a charlatan, let's just say. And that's often how they learn some skills, get the training, catch the vision for how they might be able to influence people, let's just say. Not to mention the kind of some of the sexual explorations. I guess I'm just saying I'm seeing a lot of similarities between Hubbard and Joseph Smith, even into this part of the story.
Of course, yeah, and for sure. It's so interesting the foundational events that happen in these in cult leaders' lives and how it directs them to where they end up going.
Yeah. All right. So he steals
Jack's girl.
Yeah.
Now but it gets better. Now somewhere, and I'm not sure, I've never been able to figure out exactly when, but somewhere along the line, Hubbard learned how to hypnotize people, and he was actually good at it. So that was a skill that he also obtained during this time period or before it. I think it was here. I think it was around this time or just before. But nobody's really clear on exactly precisely when he learned how to do it. But everybody knows and commented on the fact that he could. And he would do it as a party trick. He'd wrap a towel around his head. He told stories about this. And he said it was actually very, very easy to do. And he would comment in some of his lectures about how easy it would be to fool people. And it was interesting because he was doing that and commenting on it at the same time. But the way he presented Dianetics, it seemed like he was talking about that, but he was presenting Dianetics as a foil or a counter to hypnotism. And yet, anyway, we'll get to that, but that's exactly what he was doing to people. So it needs to be noted that he had that skill and it was something that he was actually good at.
And this is very reminiscent of Joseph Smith's his treasure digging, glass looking, where he would convince people that he had the ability to find buried treasure when he never did. But he knew that he had the power to make people believe that he had the power to find buried treasure. So it's that learning can have undue influence on people and then figuring out how to make a living off of that, basically.
Precisely. And I have to note, I didn't bring this up earlier, but just because you brought up the treasure hunting thing, I have to mention that Hubbard famously was involved in his 20s, right after college, in a voyage to, I think, Puerto Rico to find buried treasure. And it was a total mess. It was a complete disaster. They turned around before they even got there, or got there, and hardly anybody was left. And it was just the whole thing was a mess. Hubbard was a very poor organizer. He always was. He had very little business sense. He had very poor organizational skills. And he spent money as fast as he got it. He was that kind of a personality. He would always just sort of, I'll glow it right, I'll get more money somehow. And he always somehow managed to pull stuff off. But there were times during this time period, especially during the 1940s, where Hubbard really was on the skids and really almost completely, dead broke. So he was struggling during this time. So Parsons was a way he thought he'd, be able to stop struggling. Okay, so he gets involved in the sex magic stuff. Now, there is evidence from Hubbard's personal writings during this time that were uncovered decades later that Hubbard actually believed in this magic stuff too, or at least in the aspect of a guardian spirit. Because why would you write about that in your private papers that you would never expect to have exposed? Not a book, not a memo, not an editorial, but his own journals, right, where he would write about this stuff. And specifically what he wrote were self-hypnosis commands, where he referred to his guardian spirit and how he was the master of all men and he was, desirable by all women and men envied him. He had pages and pages and pages of these these things, that he would engage in self-hypnosis sessions to convince himself of this stuff. We also know that he physically wasn't well. He had intestinal problems. He had vision problems, and he was trying to self-hypnotize himself out of that stuff too. So the 40s was an interesting time for Hubbard. There was all kinds of stuff he was involved in. But what ended up happening at Parsons' place was he does this sex magic stuff, but he also is always looking for the angle.
Okay, how can give us a 3-sentence description of what sex magic is?
Ritualized ceremonies for personal enlightenment and power, personal power.
That involves sex.
Sex, yes, and blood. Yeah, there's like cutting and like a chalice, and you put some blood in it, and you mix in the wine, and you drink it, and or you jerk off or something. I mean, there was just all kinds of I don't know all the specifics of the rituals, except that it involved those things. This has been very well described.
Sex, blood, wine, some type of ritual.
Yeah.
With the intent of what? With the intent of?
Of creating a moon child.
Oh.
There was this idea that they were going to create the Antichrist or this moon child. And it's a little hazy because of Crowley's mixture of Christian beliefs with other stuff. It's not exactly like they're just creating the Antichrist out of Apocalypse or something. I mean, there's all kinds of other stuff mixed into it. It's a complicated mythological system that Crowley created. Most of it while he was on some very, very, very serious hallucinogenic drugs. So trying to read through Crowley's materials, which I've tried to do, and make sense of them is extremely difficult.
But you have a sense that Hubbard did believe in some sort of supernatural force that he was flirting with or playing with.
Absolutely. No question about it.
So there was sincere religious belief there, or metaphysical belief there.
Yes. He believed in a guardian spirit that was watching over him. And I believe he said she had flaming red hair like his.
Right.
And so he kind of got on that Parsons train and started writing it. And he perhaps did it for self-improvement. That could have definitely been part of the picture, or self-aggrandizement and personal power. He was very, very, you could tell from his own personal writings, like I said, that he was very into the idea of dominating other people, of being superior to other men and being desirable by all women, was something that really appealed to him. These were life goals for him. So he wasn't just a regular guy trying to get along in life. He had delusions of grandeur, and he tried to make those manifest in the real world. And this was one of his first attempts at a supernatural solution to those problems, to those delusions. That's why this period is so important, because it's the first time that we know of that he maybe tried to touch back into that reality that he thought he had touched into from that dental surgery.
Right.
Maybe trying to connect those dots there.
Right.
So I think there was personal interest in this magic stuff as a conduit or route to be able to do that. Didn't really work out so well, but that's what he tried to do.